Chapter 4. The dyer, as Diva had feared, proved perfidious, and it was not till the next morning that her maid brought her the parcel containing the coat and skirt of the projected costume. Diva had already done her marketing, so that she might have no other calls on her time to interfere with the tacking on of the bunches of pink roses, and she hoped to have the dress finished in time for Elizabeth's afternoon bridge party next day, an invitation to which had just reached her. She had also settled to have a cold lunch today, so that her cook, as well as her parlour-maid, could devote themselves to the job. She herself had taken the jacket for decoration, and was just tacking the first rose onto the collar, when she looked out of the window, and what she saw caused her needle to fall from her nerveless hand. Tripping across the opposite pavement was Elizabeth. She had on a dress, the material of which, after a moment's gaze, Diva identified. It was that corn-coloured coat and skirt which she had worn so much last spring. But the collar, the cuffs, the waistband, and the hem of the skirt were covered with staring red poppies. Next moment she called to remembrance the chintz that had once covered Elizabeth's sofa in the garden-room. Diva wasted no time, but rang the bell. She had to make certain. "Janet," she said, "go straight out into the High Street, and walk close behind Miss Mapp. Look very carefully at her dress. See if the poppies on it are of chintz." Janet's face fell. "Why, ma'am, she's never gone and—" she began. "Quick!" said Diva in a strangled voice. Diva watched from her window. Janet went out, looked this way and that, spied the quarry, and skimmed up the High Street on feet that twinkled as fast as her mistress's. She came back much out of breath, with speed and indignation. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "They're chintz, sure enough. Tacked on, too, just as you were meaning to do. Oh, ma'am." Janet quite appreciated the magnitude of the calamity, and her voice failed. "What are we to do, ma'am?" she added. Diva did not reply for a moment, but sat with eyes closed in profound and concentrated thought. It required no reflection to decide how impossible it was to appear herself tomorrow in a dress which seemed to ape the costume which all Tilling had seen Elizabeth wearing today. And at first it looked as if there was nothing to be done with all those laboriously acquired bunches of rosebuds, for it was clearly out of the question to use them as the decoration for any costume, and idle to think of sewing them back into the snipped and gashed curtains. She looked at the purple skirt and coat that hungered for their flowers, and then she looked at Janet. Janet was a short, roundabout person. It was ill-naturedly supposed that she had much the same figure as her mistress. Then the light broke, dazzling and diabolical, and Diva bounced to her feet, blinded by its splendour. "My coat and skirt are yours, Janet," she said. "Get with the work, both of you. Bustle. Cover it with roses. Have it finished tonight. Wear it tomorrow. Wear it always." She gave a loud cackle of laughter and threaded her needle. "Law, ma'am," said Janet admiringly, "that's a teaser. And thank you, ma'am." It was roses, roses all the way. Diva had quite miscalculated the number required, and there were sufficient not only to cover collar, cuffs, and border of the skirt with them, but to make another line of them 6 inches above the hem. Original and gorgeous as the dress would be, it was yet a sort of parody of Elizabeth's costume, which was attracting so much interest and attention as she popped in and out of shops today. Tomorrow that would be worn by Janet, and Janet, or Diva was much mistaken, should encourage her friends to get permission to use up old bits of chintz. Very likely chintz decoration would become quite a vogue among the servant maids of Tilling. How Elizabeth had got hold of the idea mattered nothing, but anyhow she would be surfeited with the idea before Diva had finished with her. It was possible, of course, anything was possible, that it had occurred to her independently, but Diva was loath to give so innocent an ancestry to her adoption of it. It was far more sensible to take for granted that she had got wind of Diva's intention by some odious, underhand piece of spying. What that might be must be investigated, and probably determined later, but at present the business of Janet's roses eclipsed every other interest. Miss Mapp's shopping that morning was unusually prolonged, for it was important that every woman in Tilling should see the poppies on the corn-coloured ground, and know that she had worn that dress before Diver appeared in some mean adaptation of it. Though the total cost of her entire purchases hardly amounted to a shilling, she went in and out of an amazing number of shops, and made a prodigious series of inquiries into the price of commodities that ranged from motor cars to sealing wax, and often entered a shop twice because, wreathed in smiling apologies for her stupidity, she had forgotten what she was told the first time. By 12 o'clock, she was satisfied that practically everybody, with one exception, had seen her, and that her costume had aroused a deep sense of jealousy and angry admiration. So cunning was the handiwork of herself, Withers, and Mary, that she felt fairly sure that no one had the slightest notion of how this decoration of poppies was accomplished, for Evie had run around her in small mouse-like circles, murmuring to herself, "Very effective idea. Is it woven into the cloth, Elizabeth? Dear me, I wonder where I could get some like it." And Mrs. Poppet had followed her all up the street, with eyes glued to the hem of her skirt, and a completely puzzled face. But then, so thought Elizabeth sweetly, even members of the Order of the British Empire can't have everything their own way. As for the Major, he had simply come to a dead stop when he bounced out of his house as he passed, and said something very gallant and appropriate. Even the absence of that one inhabitant of Tilling, dear Diver, did not strike a jarring note in this paean of triumph, for Miss Mapp was quite satisfied that Diver was busy indoors, working her fingers to the bone over the application of bunches of roses, and, as usual, she was perfectly correct in her conjecture. But dear Diver would have to see the new frock tomorrow afternoon at the latest, when she came to the bridge party. Perhaps she would then, for the first time, be wearing the roses herself, and everybody would very pleasantly pity her. This was so rapturous a thought that when Miss Mapp, after her prolonged shopping and with her almost empty basket, passed Mr. Hopkins standing outside his shop, on her return home again, she gave him her usual smile, though without meeting his eye, and tried to forget how much of him she had seen yesterday. Perhaps she might speak to him tomorrow, and gradually resume ordinary relations, for the prices at the other fish shop were as high as the quality of the fish was low. She told herself that there was nothing actually immoral in the human skin, however embarrassing it was. Miss Mapp had experienced a cruel disappointment last night, though the triumph of this morning had done something to soothe it, for Major Benjy's window had certainly been lit up to a very late hour, and so it was clear that he had not been able, twice in succession, to tear himself away from his diaries, or whatever else detained him, and go to bed at a proper time. Captain Puffin, however, had not sat up late. Indeed, he must have gone to bed quite unusually early, for his window was dark by 9:30. Tonight, again, the position was reversed, and it seemed that Major Benjy was good and Captain Puffin was bad. On the whole, then, there was cause for thankfulness, and as she added a tin of biscuits and 2 jars of Bovril to her prudent stores, she found herself a conscious sceptic about those Roman roads. Diaries, perhaps, were a little different, for egoism was a more potent force than archaeology, and for her part, she now definitely believed that Roman roads spelt some form of drink. She was sorry to believe it, but it was her duty to believe something of the kind, and she really did not know what else to believe. She did not go so far as mentally to accuse him of drunkenness, but considering the way he absorbed red currant fool, it was clear that he was no foe to alcohol, and probably watered the Roman roads with it. With her vivid imagination, she pictured him— Miss Mapp recalled herself from this melancholy reflection, and put up her hand just in time to save a bottle of Bovril, which she had put on the top shelf in front of the sack of flour, from tumbling to the ground. With the latest additions she had made to her larder, it required considerable ingenuity to fit all the tins and packages in, and for a while she diverted her mind from Captain Puffin's drinking to her own eating. But by careful packing and balancing, she managed to stow everything away with sufficient economy of space to allow her to shut the door, and then put the card table in place again. It was then late, and with a fond look at her sweet flowers sleeping in the moonlight, she went to bed. Captain Puffin's sitting room was still alight, and even as she deplored this, his shadow in profile crossed the blind. Shadows were queer things. She could make a beautiful shadow rabbit on the wall by a dexterous interlacement of fingers and thumbs, and certainly this shadow, in the momentary glance she had of it, appeared to have a large moustache. She could make nothing whatever out of that, except to suppose that just as fingers and thumbs become a rabbit, so his nose became a moustache, for he could not have grown one since he came back from golf. She was out early for her shopping next morning, for there were some delicacies to be purchased for her bridge party, more particularly some little chocolate cakes she had lately discovered, which looked very small and innocent, were in reality of so cloying and substantial a nature that the partaker thereof would probably not feel capable of making any serious inroads into other provisions. Naturally, she was much on the alert today, for it was more than possible that Diver's dress was finished and in evidence. What colour it would be she did not know, but a large quantity of rosebuds would, even at a distance, make identification easy. Diver was certainly not at her window this morning, so it seemed more than probable that they would soon meet. Far away, just crossing the high street at the further end, she caught sight of a bright patch of purple, very much of the required shape. There was surely a pink border round the skirt, and a pink panel on the collar, and just as surely Mrs. Bartlett, recognizable for her gliding mouse-like walk, was moving in its fascinating wake. Then the purple patch vanished into a shop, and Miss Mapp, all smiles and poppies, went with her basket up the street. Presently she encountered Evie, who, also all smiles, seemed to have some communication to make, but only got as far as, "Have you seen—" when she gave a little squeal of laughter, quite inexplicable, and glided into some dark entry. A minute afterwards, the purple patch suddenly appeared from a shop and almost collided with her. It was not Diver at all, but Diver's Janet. The shock was so indescribably severe that Miss Mapp's smile was frozen, so to speak, as by some sudden congealment onto her face, and did not thaw off it till she had reached the sharp turn at the end of the street, where she leaned heavily on the railing and breathed through her nose. A light autumnal mist overlay the miles of marsh, but the sun was already drinking it up, promising the Tillingites another golden day. The tidal river was at the flood, and the bright water lapped the bases of the turf-covered banks that kept it within its course. Beyond that was the tram station, towards which presently Major Benjy and Captain Puffin would be hurrying to catch the tram that would take them out to the golf links. The straight road across the marsh was visible, and the railway bridge. All these things were pitilessly unchanged, and Miss Mapp noted them blankly, until rage began to restore the numbed current of her mental processes. If the records of history contained any similar instance of such treachery and low cunning as was involved in this plot of Diver's to dress Janet in the rosebud chintz, Miss Mapp would have liked to be told clearly and distinctly what it was. She could trace the workings of Diver's base mind with absolute accuracy, and if all the archangels in the hierarchy of heaven had assured her that Diver had originally intended the rosebuds for Janet, she would have scorned them for their clumsy perjury. Diver had designed and executed that dress for herself, and just because Miss Mapp's ingenuity, inspired by the 2 rosebuds that had fluttered out of the window, had forestalled her, she had taken this fiendish revenge. It was impossible to pervade the high street covered with chintz poppies when a parlour-maid was being equally pervasive in chintz rosebuds, and what was to be done with this frock executed with such mirth and malice by Withers, Mary, and herself, she had no idea. She might just as well give it Withers, for she could no longer wear it herself, or tear the poppies from the hem and bestrew the high street with them. Miss Mapp's face froze into immobility again, for here, trundling swiftly towards her, was Diver herself. Diver appeared not to see her till she got quite close. "Morning, Elizabeth," she said. "Seen my Janet anywhere?" "No," said Miss Mapp. Janet, no doubt according to instructions received, popped out of a shop and came towards her mistress. Here she is, said Diver. All right, Janet, you go home. I'll see to the other things. It's a lovely day, said Miss Mapp, beginning to lash her tail. So bright. Yes, pretty trimming of poppies, said Diver. Janet's got rosebuds. This was too much. Diver, I didn't think it of you, said Miss Mapp in a shaking voice. You saw my new frock yesterday, and you were filled with malice and envy, Diver, just because I had thought of using flowers off an old chintz as well as you, and came out first with it. You had meant to wear that purple frock yourself, though I must say it fits Janet perfectly, and just because I was first in the field, you did this. You gave Janet that frock, so that I should be dressed in the same style as your parlour-maid, and you've got a black heart, Diver. That's nonsense, said Diver firmly. Heart's as red as anybody's, and talking of black hearts doesn't become you, Elizabeth. You knew I was cutting out roses from my curtains. Miss Mapp laughed shrilly. Well, if I happen to notice that you've taken your chintz curtains down, she said, with an awful distinctness that showed the wisdom teeth of which Diver had got 3 at the most, and pink bunches of roses come flying out your window into the high street, even my poor wits, small as they are equal to drawing the conclusion that you are cutting roses out of curtains. Your well-known fondness for dress did the rest. With your permission, Diver, I intend to draw exactly what conclusions I please on every occasion, including this one. Ha! That's how you got the idea, then, said Diver. I knew you had cribbed it from me. Cribbed? Asked Miss Mapp, in ironical ignorance of what so vulgar and slangy an expression meant. Cribbed means taking what isn't yours, said Diver. Even then, if you had only acted in a straightforward manner. Miss Mapp, shaken as with palsy, regretted that she had let slip, out of pure childlike joy, in irony, the manner in which she had obtained the poppy notion, but in a quarrel regrets are useless, and she went on again. And would you very kindly explain how or when I have acted in a manner that was not straightforward? She asked, with laborious politeness. Or do I understand that a monopoly of cutting up chintz curtains for personal adornment has been bestowed on you by an Act of Parliament? You knew I was meaning to make a frock with chintz roses on it, said Diver. You stole my idea. Worked night and day to be first, just like you. Just like you. Mean behaviour. It was meaner to give that frock to Janet, said Miss Mapp. You can give yours to Withers, snapped Diver. Much obliged, Mrs. Plasto, said Miss Mapp. Diver had been watching Janet's retreating figure, and feeling that though revenge was sweet, revenge was also strangely expensive, for she had sacrificed one of the most strikingly successful frocks she had ever made on that smoking altar. Now her revenge was gratified, and deeply she regretted the frock. Miss Mapp's heart was similarly wrung by torture. Revenge, too, had been hers, general revenge on Diver for existing, but this dreadful counterstroke had made it quite impossible for her to enjoy the use of this frock any more, for she could not habit herself like a housemaid. Each, in fact, had, as matters at present stood, completely wrecked the other, like 2 express trains meeting in top-speed collision, and since the quarrel had clearly risen to its utmost height, there was no farther joy of battle to be anticipated, but only the melancholy task of counting the corpses. So they paused, breathing very quickly and trembling, while both sought for some way out. Besides, Miss Mapp had a bridge party this afternoon, and if they parted now in this extreme state of tension, Diver might conceivably not come, thereby robbing herself of bridge and spoiling her hostess's table. Naturally, any permanent quarrel was not contemplated by either of them, for if quarrels were permanent in Tilling, nobody would be on speaking terms any more with anyone else in a day or 2. And, hardly less disastrous, there could be no fresh quarrels with anybody, since you could not quarrel without words. There might be songs without words, as Mendelssohn had proved, but not rows without words. By what formula could this deadly antagonism be bridged without delay? Diver gazed out over the marsh. She wanted desperately to regain her rosebud frock, and she knew that Elizabeth was starving for further wearing of her poppies. Perhaps the wide, serene plain below inspired her with a hatred of littleness. There would be no loss of dignity in making a proposal that her enemy, she felt sure, would accept. It merely showed a Christian spirit, and set an example to Elizabeth to make the first move. Janet she did not consider. "If you are in a fit state to listen to reason, Elizabeth," she began. Miss Mapp heaved a sigh of relief. Diver had thought of something. She swallowed the insult at a gulp. "Yes, dear," she said. "Got an idea. Take away Janet's frock, and wear it myself. Then you can wear yours. Too pretty for parlour-maids, eh?" A heavenly brightness spread over Miss Mapp's face. "Oh, how wonderful of you to have thought of that, Diver," she said. "But how shall we explain it all to everybody?" Diver clung to her rights. Though clearly Christian, she was human. "Say I thought of tacking chintz on, and told you," she said. "Yes, darling," said Elizabeth. "That's beautiful, I agree. But poor Janet." "I'll give her some other old thing," said Diver. "Good sort, Janet. Wants me to win." "And about her having been seen wearing it?" "Say she hasn't ever worn it. Say they're mad," said Diver. Miss Mapp felt it better to tear herself away before she began distilling all sorts of acidities that welled up in her fruitful mind. She could, for instance, easily have agreed that nothing was more probable than that Janet had been mistaken for her mistress. "Au reservoir, then, dear," she said tenderly. "See you at about 4, and will you wear your pretty rosebud frock?" This was agreed to, and Diver went home to take it away from Janet. The reconciliation, of course, was strictly confined to matters relating to chintz, and did not include such extraneous subjects as coal strike or food hoarding, and even in the first glowing moments of restored friendliness, Diver began wondering whether she would have the opportunity that afternoon of testing the truth of her conjecture about the cupboard in the garden-room. Cudgel her brains as she might, she could think of no other cache that could contain the immense amount of provisions that Elizabeth had probably accumulated, and she was all on fire to get to practical grips with the problem. As far as tins of corned beef and tongues went, Elizabeth might possibly have buried them in her garden in the manner of a dog, but it was not likely that a hoarder would limit herself to things in tins. No. There was a cupboard somewhere, ready to burst with strong supporting foods. Diver intentionally arrived a full quarter of an hour on the hither side of punctuality, and was taken by Withers out into the garden-room, where tea was laid, and 2 card tables were in readiness. She was, of course, the first of the guests, and the moment Withers withdrew to tell her mistress that she had come, Diver stealthily glided to the cupboard, from in front of which the bridge table had been removed, feeling the shrill joy of some romantic treasure hunter. She found the catch, she pressed it, she pulled open the door, and the whole of the damning profusion of provisions burst upon her delighted eyes. Shelf after shelf was crowded with eatables. There were tins of corned beef and tongues. That she knew already. There was a sack of flour. There were tubes of Bath Oliver biscuits, bottles of Bovril, the yield of 1,000 condensed Swiss cows, jars of prunes. All these were in the front row flush with the door, and who knew to what depth the cupboard extended? Even as she feasted her eyes on this incredible store, some package on the top shelf wavered and toppled, and she had only just time to shut the door again in order to prevent it falling out onto the floor. But this displacement prevented the door from wholly closing, and push and shove as Diver might, she could not get the catch to click home, and the only result of her energy and efforts was to give rise to a muffled explosion from within, just precisely as if something made of cardboard had burst. That mental image was so vivid that to her fevered imagination it seemed to be real. This was followed by certain faint taps from within against elegant extracts and astronomy. Diver grew very red in the face, and said, "Drat it," under her breath. She did not dare open the door again, in order to push things back, for fear of an uncontrollable stream of things pouring out. Some nicely balanced equilibrium had clearly been upset in those capacious shelves, and it was impossible to tell, without looking, how deep and how extensive the disturbance was, and in order to look, she had to open the bookcase again. Luckily, the pressure against the door was not sufficiently heavy to cause it to swing wide, so the best she could do was leave it just ajar, with temporary quiescence inside. Simultaneously, she heard Miss Mapp's step, and had no more than time to trundle at the utmost speed of her whirling feet across to the window, where she stood looking out, and appeared quite unconscious of her hostess's entry. "Diva, darling, how sweet of you to come so early," she said. "A little cosy chat before the others arrive." Diva turned round, much startled. "Hello," she said. "Didn't hear you. Got Janet's frock, you see." "What makes Diva's face so red?" thought Miss Mapp. "So I see, darling," she said. "Lovely rose garden. How well it suits you, dear. Did Janet mind?" "No. Promised her a new frock at Christmas." "That will be nice for Janet," said Elizabeth enthusiastically. "Shall we pop into the garden, dear, till my guests come?" Diva was glad to pop into the garden and get away from the immediate vicinity of the cupboard, for though she had planned and looked forward to the exposure of Elizabeth's hoarding, she had not meant it to come, as it now probably would, in crashes of tins and bursting of Bovril bottles. Again, she had intended to have opened that door quite casually and innocently while she was being dummy, so that everyone could see how accidental the exposure was, and to have gone poking about the cupboard in Elizabeth's absence was a shade too professional, so to speak, for the usual detective work of Tilling. But the fuse was set now. Sooner or later the explosion must come. She wondered, as they went out to commune with Elizabeth's sweet flowers till the other guests arrived, how great a torrent would be let loose. She did not repent her exploration, far from it, but her pleasurable anticipations were strongly diluted with suspense. Miss Mapp had found such difficulty in getting 8 players together today that she had transgressed her principles and asked Mrs. Poppet as well as Isabel, and they, with Diva, the 2 Bartletts, and the Major and the Captain, formed the party. The moment Mrs. Poppet appeared, Elizabeth hated her more than ever, for she put up her glasses and began to give her patronizing advice about her garden, which she had not been allowed to see before. "You have quite a pretty little piece of garden, Miss Mapp," she said, "though to be sure I fancied from what you said that it was more extensive. Dear me, your roses do not seem to be doing very well. Probably they are old plants and want renewing. You must send your gardener round. You keep a gardener, and I will let you have a dozen vigorous young bushes." Miss Mapp licked her dry lips. She kept a kind of gardener, 2 days a week. "Too good of you," she said, "but that rosebed is quite sacred, dear Mrs. Poppet. Not all the vigorous young bushes in the world would tempt me. It's my friendship's border. Some dear friend gave me each of my rose trees." Mrs. Poppet transferred her gaze to the wisteria that grew over the steps up to the garden room. Some of the dear friends, she thought, must be centenarians. "Your wisteria wants pruning, sadly," she said. "Your gardener does not understand wisterias. That corner there was made, I may say, for fuchsias. You should get a dozen choice fuchsias." Miss Mapp laughed. "You must excuse me," she said with a glance at Mrs. Poppet's brocaded silk. "I can't bear fuchsias. They always remind me of overdressed women. Ah, there's Mr. Bartlett. How do you do, Padre? And dear Evie." Dear Evie appeared fascinated by Diva's dress. "Such beautiful rosebuds," she murmured. "And what a lovely shade of purple. And Elizabeth's poppies, too. Quite a pair of you. But surely this morning, Diva, didn't I see your good Janet in just such another dress? And I thought at the time how odd it was that—" "If you saw Janet this morning," said Diva quite firmly, "you saw her in her print dress." "And here's Major Benjy," said Miss Mapp, who had made her slip about his Christian name yesterday, and had been duly entreated to continue slipping. "And Captain Puffin. Well, that is nice. Shall we go into my little garden shed, dear Mrs. Poppet, and have our tea?" Major Flint was still a little lame, for his golf today had been of the nature of gardening, and he hobbled up the steps behind the ladies, with that little cock-sparrow sailor following him and telling the Padre how badly and yet how successfully he himself had played. "Pleasantest room in Tilling, I always say, Miss Elizabeth," said he, diverting his mind from a mere game to the fairies. "My dear little room," said Miss Mapp, knowing that it was much larger than anything in Mrs. Poppet's house. So tiny. Oh, not a bad-sized room, said Mrs. Poppet encouragingly. Much the same proportions on a very small scale as the throne-room at Buckingham Palace. That beautiful throne-room, exclaimed Miss Mapp. A cup of tea, dear Mrs. Poppet? None of that naughty red-currant fool, I am afraid. And a little chocolate cake? These substantial chocolate cakes soon did their fell work of producing the sense of surfeit, and presently Elizabeth's guests dropped off gorged from the tea-table. Diver fortunately remembered their consistency in time, and nearly cleared a plate of jumbles instead, which the hostess had hoped would form a pleasant accompaniment to her dessert at her supper this evening, and was still crashingly engaged on them when the general drifting movement towards the two bridge tables set in. Mrs. Poppet, with her glasses up, followed by Isabel, was employed in making a tour of the room, in case, as Miss Mapp had already determined, she never saw it again, examining the quality of the carpet, the curtains, the chair-backs, with the air of a doubtful purchaser. "And quite a quantity of books, I see," she announced as she came opposite the fatal cupboard. "Look, Isabel, what a quantity of books! There is something strange about them, though. I do not believe they are real." She put out her hand and pulled at the back of one of the volumes of elegant extracts. The door swung open, and from behind it came a noise of rattling, bumping, and clattering. Something soft and heavy thumped onto the floor, and a cloud of floury dust arose. A bottle of Bovril embedded itself quietly there without damage, and a tin of Bath Oliver biscuits beat a fierce tattoo on one of corned beef. Innumerable dried apricots from the burst package flew about like shrapnel and tapped at the tins. A jar of prunes, breaking its fall on the flour, rolled merrily out into the middle of the floor. The din was succeeded by complete silence. The padre had said, "What ho with eggs?" during the tumult, but his voice had been drowned by the rattling of the dried apricots. The member of the Order of the British Empire stepped free of the provisions that bumped round her and examined them through her glasses. Diva crammed the last jumble into her mouth and disposed of it with the utmost rapidity. The birthday of her life had come, as Miss Rossetti said. "Dear Elizabeth," she exclaimed, "what a disaster! All your little stores in case of the coal strike. Let me help to pick them up. I do not think anything is broken. Isn't that lucky?" Evie hurried to the spot. "Such a quantity of good things," she said rapidly under her breath. "Tinned meats, and Bovril, and prunes, and ever so many apricots. Let me pick them all up, and with a little dusting. Why, what a big cupboard, and such a quantity of good things." Miss Mapp had certainly struck a streak of embarrassments. What with naked Mr. Hopkins, and Janet's frock, and this unveiling of her hoard, life seemed at the moment really to consist of nothing else than beastly situations. How on earth that catch of the door had come undone, she had no idea, but much as she would have liked to suspect foul play from somebody, she was bound to conclude that Mrs. Poppet, with her prying hands, had accidentally pressed it. It was like Diva, of course, to break the silence with odious allusions to hoarding, and bitterly she wished that she had not started the topic the other day, but had been content to lay in her stores without so pointedly affirming that she was doing nothing of the kind. But this was no time for vain laments, and restraining a natural impulse to scratch and beat Mrs. Poppet, she exhibited an admirable inventiveness and composure. Though she knew it would deceive nobody, everybody had to pretend he was deceived. "Oh, my poor little Christmas presents for your needy parishioners, Padre," she said. "You've seen them before you were meant to, and you must forget all about them. And so little harm done, just an apricot or two. Withers will pick them all up, so let us get to our bridge." Withers entered the room at this moment to clear away tea, and Miss Mapp explained it all over again. "All our Christmas presents have come tumbling out, Withers," she said. "Will you put as many as you can back in the cupboard and take the rest indoors? Don't tread on the apricots." It was difficult to avoid doing this, as the apricots were everywhere, and their colour on the brown carpet was wonderfully protective. Miss Mapp herself had already stepped on 2, and their adhesive stickiness was hard to get rid of. In fact, for the next few minutes the coal shovel was in strong request for their removal from the soles of shoes, and the fender was littered with their squashed remains. The party generally was distinctly thoughtful as it sorted itself out into 2 tables, for every single member of it was trying to assimilate the amazing proposition that Miss Mapp had, halfway through September, loaded her cupboard with Christmas presents on a scale that staggered belief. The feat required thought. It required a faith so childlike as to verge on the imbecile. Conversation during deals had an awkward tendency towards discussion of the coal strike. As often as it drifted there, the subject was changed very rapidly, just as if there was some occult reason for not speaking of so natural a topic. It concerned everybody, but it was rightly felt to concern Miss Mapp the most.